Hello, my name is Liz Armitage-Chan. I'm a Professor of Higher Education at the Royal Veterinary College in London, and I have put this video together to try to provide a bit of an introduction of how I go about doing narrative research, because my master's students and colleagues have found that it's very difficult to find short and easily accessible introductions to the methods of carrying out narrative research. This certainly isn't intended to replace a more in-depth exploration of what narrative means and what narrative methods involve. Certainly there is great benefit in immersing yourself in what narrative means, particularly from a researcher positioning and thinking about participant research and in-depth inquiry. But hopefully this provides a little bit more of an easier way in to those embarking on that kind of study. I am someone who used narrative for my own PhD research, as well as a few projects since then, and I supervise master's students who do master's research. There's some key references shown on the slide that describe my approach to doing narrative research in detail, and it's really important to say that this is only my approach. It's something that I've developed that works for me. Lots of other approaches will exist, and if you're an experienced narrative researcher, then you undoubtedly will have your own research approaches that may be different to mine, may not be. Lots and lots of alternatives exist. This is my approach, it's what works for me, and I'll tell you about it, and I hope it's useful. One of the first things colleagues often ask me is, why are we doing narrative? So I think the answer to that is that narrative helps us to look in depth at the experiences of something that is intangible or not very well understood or unknown to the participants involved in your research. So I've used narrative a fair amount in the past to look at identity. Obviously identity involves perhaps digging in underneath a participant's level of self-awareness of who they are to something a little bit deeper and less tangible. It's also useful to use storytelling to explore experiences of something that might be difficult for a participant to talk about. For example, experiences of severe ill health using patient narratives. I've also used it to tap into students' experiences of learning something complex that they may not be able to articulate how they've learnt that very easily, and so we use stories about that experience to again tap into that less tangible aspect of that complex learning. So the idea of narrative is that through storytelling, people will make choices about what they include about that event or that experience, and those choices will depend on the aspects of that experience that mean something to them, either because it really resonated in a positive way, and they felt something click, and it felt as though it was something that really described who they were and their approach and something that really fit with them, or because of the opposite, and it's something that they found very difficult or very challenging, very at odds with who they are or their values or their passions, and so that particularly hit at a very meaningful level. The key thing is that narratives of an experience, stories of an experience, will be very individually different, because different aspects of an event will mean different things to different people. So the way that this is often talked about is using Bruner's conception of paradigmatic understanding of an event versus narrative understanding of an event. He described paradigmatic understanding as more factual, something that actually happened. So if we interviewed 100 people about attending a conference or going to the theatre or learning something, then we could find repeatable themes within that. We could find where the consistencies are. We could find perhaps common approaches that students use in their learning, what resources they find useful, what practices they find useful, and that would be a paradigmatic level of understanding. a narrative level of understanding, the way I most commonly describe this is if you take those same people that attended a conference or the theatre and looked at their individual stories, then their individual stories, as well as having some common elements, will also differ quite a lot. So they might tell you about different aspects of the play or the conference talk. Somebody might tap into more what happened in the queue for the coffee at the beginning, or someone they were sat next to in the lecture theatre at the conference, or one person might really go into a lot of detail about one part of the lecture, and the person sat right next to them might say, well, I don't even remember that at all. And that individual difference is a way of being able to interpret what is meaningful, what is interesting, where somebody's passions lie relating to that experience, because of course we are all different, and so the stories that we take away from common experiences will tell us a little bit about ourselves, what we're interested in, what our identities are, what we found particularly easy or challenging. So what do we mean by narrative text? Well, we use that term story a lot. So classically, according to the references shown on the slide, a story is an individual way of retelling events that expresses a personal meaning, conveys a message, or presents the individual's level of understanding of that event or experience. Typically, stories are defined by including an event. There'd be a very boring story if there wasn't an event involved. They include the place and the time that it happened. They include the people who were involved, so the players, the cast of that story. And they also include some kind of evaluative statements, so emotions that were experienced, judgments about different aspects of the story. We can classify those as broadly speaking positive or negative emotions, although obviously often when we're analysing it's a little bit more complex than that, and something can be experienced both positively and negatively, but it provides a way to help us to analyse the narrative. And really, really key to a lot of narrative research is not only that the data source or the thing that we're studying is a narrative, is a story. It also is the way that we're carrying out that research. So we are studying a story, and we are studying it by story and through story. So in narrative methods, narrative is often the phenomenon and the method. And so the words on the screen not only provide you with a description of what storied text or storied data look like, it also provides you with your method. It also provides you with your framework as to how you're going to analyse the narrative. And you'll see that on my next slide. So when we are analysing our data, when I have my narrative text, how do I go about analysing it? Well, I'm a veterinarian by background. I grew up in a very positivist world of drugs that work or don't, and diagnoses that were true or not true. And so that slightly positivist background meant for me that I needed a toolkit to help myself to immerse myself in the data, to analyse the data, to work with the data. So I've developed from the literature a series of very defined steps. I find having those defined steps also works brilliantly for me, because I often have to sadly break away from my data analysis. I have to go and go to a meeting, or go and do some teaching, or pick up my children from school, or walk my dog, or cook some tea, or whatever it is. And so these really, really well-defined steps have created a series of signposts for me that means that if I step away, even for a number of days, then I find it very easy to get back into it. I know exactly what to do and how to pick up that data analysis again. So the processes that I'm going to describe, the steps that work for me, are based on the literature, and something that you'll quite often find in descriptions of analysing narrative text is that it's a repeated process of first disassembling the data and then reassembling it into a re-storied version of the participants' experiences. And so what I'm going to take you through now is how I go through that disassembly, reassembly process. So this is where those frameworks from, I lied, it wasn't the last slide, but the slide before last, this is where those frameworks that describe what a story is help you in analysing the data. So as you can see, the first step that I do in data disassembly is I create a table with a series of column headings that are based, in this example, which comes from a Lebovian framework, which I used in my 2020 paper. I use the event, the place, the players, those evaluative statements, and also the meaning or the message that I think the person is trying to convey in their storytelling. You'll notice over on the right-hand side of the table, I also have a column that says other and unsaid. I always have an other column in my data analysis, and that's because although I have my framework, although I have my conceptual framework as well, that really helps. It helps for signposting, it helps me really get into the data, it helps me really kind of dig deep into it and disassemble it, but I don't want it to close me off too much from anything that the participants might be saying that is meaningful to them, but for whatever reason doesn't fit into one of the categories that I have already. So if I see something that is particularly powerful, particularly obvious in a participant's story, but it doesn't fit with any of my other column headings, then I'll pop it in that other column heading. The other column heading that you'll see on there is what is unsaid, and this relates to narrative being usually carried out by what we call a practitioner researcher or an expert researcher, somebody who is really, really familiar with the field, with the phenomenon that they're studying. Usually they've had shared experiences or are having shared experiences as the participants that they're studying. So because we know what that experience looks like, we know the different ways that that event could have been told in a story, then not only can we capture and analyse what was included and what was said, we can also capture and analyse what wasn't included, and we can think about, well, I know that happened, so why didn't it come up in the story? What does that tell me about the person and the way they're thinking about their experience and the way they're working through this process, that they missed out this thing that I know was there? So I always include that column for whatever was unsaid, so I can capture that as well. And so what does that actually look like when I'm doing it? Well, this is some data I'm analysing at the moment. I've called it Work in Progress 2025 because it doesn't have a working title yet. You can see I've got my table on the screen. It's not exactly the same as the framework that I used in the previous slide. This is based on a slightly different methodology because of the thing I was studying. A feminism methodology worked, and in feminism methodology you additionally focus on emotions and relationships. So those are appearing in my table as well. My conceptual framework related to cognitive load theory. So in addition, I wanted to include what was happening cognitively in these stories, and also what was happening behaviourally. I referred to that as the participants' practice, but it's basically the behaviours. I also wanted, for a particular reason in this research, to include the participants' belief systems relating to their epistemological positioning, so how they think about knowledge, how they think about learning, and you'll see that other category as well. And so the first stage of my disassembly, I've printed out my transcript, I've allocated a colour to each of my column headings, and I go through my transcript highlighting sections of the transcript depending on whether I feel they are emotions, relationships, cognition, practice, beliefs, or other. Obviously, things don't fit neatly into one category, often they cross categories, and so that then turns into my scribbled notes that you can also see on that printout. I'll also start scribbling in a neutral colour, a black biro or something like that, my early interpretations of what's happening. So if I'm reading something and I think, oh, this is interesting, I think they might be saying this, or I think they might be talking about this, or I think it might be conveying this, then I'll write that in the margin as well. So this is an initial stage of disassembling my data by highlighting and note taking according to the categories on my table, and I'm not really thinking at any level higher than that at this stage. I'm really just going through looking for evidence in my data of the column headings that I've identified for my framework. So what do I do next? Well, the next thing I do is I print out those tables, a blank version, one for each participant. So if you look very closely at these tables, you'll see they're labelled P1 to P7. And I go back through my transcripts again, and I start pulling out and focusing in on the areas that I've put notes by or highlighted. And I'll start either bringing in direct quotes if I think the quote exemplifies what I'm looking for really, really well, or I'll write a little summary of what the participant was saying that fits with what I've highlighted, with either with the emotion or the relationship, and I'll start trying to describe what I'm seeing for each participant within each of those columns. So it's very process driven. I can pick it up, come to it later, kind of know where I got to, just slot straight back into it, which is really, really helpful for me if I have to take a couple of days away from data analysis. You'll also see just right at the top of the slide, right at the top of the table, I've also started to take notes that I call general impressions or general themes. They're not really themes like a thematic analysis, but if I start to see the same meaning being expressed or the same messages being expressed across different participants, or I'm starting to understand a little bit more about what's happening in my participants' lives, then I'll just write notes on that piece of paper that I've called general themes, and that helps me begin to work out the meaning that might be being expressed within my research. So by that point, when I've been through the transcripts a couple of times, once to highlight and once to fill in my tables, I then feel like I've disassembled the data. I've broken it down into those tables. So now I want to start with the reassembly. This process is based on something that we call narrative understanding, which is that we're also learning through storytelling. So the storytelling was what our participants did, the story was what we've captured, the story approach was what informed our disassembly, and now the theory of story is what's helping us to analyse these stories further. So the theory of narrative understanding is that if we tell a story about something, then we learn more about that thing as we're telling it. So it's a very reflective process. I think it's really similar to when I talk to my students about reflective writing. I always tell them if you're going to write a reflective essay or a piece of reflective writing, you will learn something through that process if you remain open to learning. So have a think at the end of your story, of your reflection, how you understand what it was you were talking about in a way that's perhaps different to how you understood it before you started writing. So this process is very similar. It's also a very reflective process. It also is emphasizing and based on learning through writing this story. So it's not yet the final data reporting. It's actually just another stage in data analysis and gaining further understanding as we are beginning to pull our understanding of our participants' stories together and make sense of our data in a way that answers our research questions. So again, what do I mean by reassembly? What does it look like for me when I do my research? Well, as I say, to me it's quite a reflective process. I've described my approach to reflection in the paper that's cited at the top of this screen. And I use what I think of as being quite an in-depth reflective process. Some people describe this as repeated cycles of zooming in and zooming out of the data. We've zoomed in when we've done our data disassembly, and we're definitely now in the reflective, wider context, wider perspectives, zooming out phase. To do this properly, I feel I have to really step away from my data, put it to one side, mull over it, physically step away. I often do this either through talking to a colleague or a friend, or out walking the dog, or driving the car, or cooking tea. I find I have to sort of really switch off from intently focusing on the transcript in front of me. This is where I also bring in more of the conceptual frameworks that I'm using, more of my knowledge and experience as a practitioner researcher, or as somebody that's informed about the phenomenon I'm studying because I've read the relevant literature. And as I said, I find it really valuable to talk to people about my understanding of my data, and I really encourage my master's students to talk to me about their understanding of the data. I find that if people ask me questions about my data, that helps me explore it and understand it more as well. The question might raise a perspective that I hadn't previously thought of. So what does that look like as a process? Well, first of all, I'll take some time to reflect on the meanings that I've derived from the data, why I think those different column headings are useful, what it is about the emotion or the relationships or the cognition or the practice or whatever it is that is helping me understand that data. And then I'll step away and think about it in a wider context. I'll think about wider theories that I know about and how they might help me understand the data. That might signpost to me to go off and do a bit of reading in a different area, and that might then help me understand more about what's going on in my data. I will again talk to others to see if that helps me understand what's going on in my data. And then when I've gone through that reflective process and I've really thought about trying to understand what's going on in my data, in my participants' lives, then I'll start writing out that reconstruction using quotes and excerpts to integrate with the narrative prose. And as I say, that is my process of rewriting the story to help me gain that even deeper layer, even higher level of understanding. So what that looks like, as you can see here, I've got all my tables out on my desk, and I'm beginning to rewrite the story, rewrite my summary and interpretations of what I think is going on with the participants. You'll see that I haven't put full quotes in at this stage, but I've written a sort of a narrative text of some aspect that I'm focusing on at that moment, and then I've put down a few participants' details to remind myself that P5, P6 and P7 had something relevant that would work as a quote to evidence what I'm talking about. So I find it useful to write. I find it more purposeful to write with a pen and paper. I find it slows me down. I can think, I can go back and annotate the parts I've already written as that increase in understanding occurs to me. Then I can go back and think, oh, actually now I understand more about the bit I've already written. So rather than going back and retyping it, I'll just go and sort of scribble over it, or put a little note next to it, or have a bit of a play with it. And I'll keep working through the different types of meaning, the different areas of meaning that I've understood, a little bit like you would talk about different themes if you were doing a thematic analysis. And then as I go through that process, as I said, it will send me off into other areas. It will make me think about other theories that I'm aware of that help me understand that data. It might send me off to go and read a couple of papers. For example, the data I'm looking at the moment reminded me very much of communities of practice or social learning in professionals. So then I went off and read a few papers on that, and it gave me some more ideas, some more understanding of what might be going on in my data. And so I've written those theories out in red just to remind me to go and look at them, and some notes about how those different theories make me explore my data, make me think about my data, raise questions about my data, whatever it is. Because as you can see, I'm still going through that process of trying to understand my data as I'm writing that story, as I'm trying to rewrite a sort of narrative story about my understanding of what is going on with the thing that I'm studying. So eventually, after this process of disassembly and reassembly, and sometimes we go back to the disassembly again, particularly if one of the theories that has occurred to me during the reassembly makes me think I want to go back to my primary data, back to my transcripts, and have a look to see, for example, where there might be elements of communities of practice, or where there might be elements of leadership going on, or whatever it is. So I might go back and add a column and deconstruct it again. But once we've gone through that disassembly, reassembly, rewriting that narrative, adding to it, crossing bits out, rewriting it again, we end up with this fairly reflective narrative output, which provides an explanation of my and my research colleagues' new understanding of the phenomenon that we're studying. So whether that was identity of early career vets, or academic leaders, or the project I'm working at the moment, which is the experience of some colleagues. Now, by this point, I'll have a new level of understanding about that, and that's what I've explained and discussed as my output, as my results section, if you like. It will be interlinked with quotes and excerpts that evidence the meaning and the messages that I'm talking about. But what I often find in narrative work is that because it's so interpretivist, because it's such a holistic understanding of the whole narrative, rather than being broken down into codes and then themes, it can be quite difficult to find short quotes that evidence that holistic meaning that I've captured. And so what I'll find is, when I write it up, that the length of my quotes and the length of my narratives are sort of similar. Or if you look back at the reflection paper, you'll find that the lengths of the quotes are actually pretty long. They're actually sort of mini narratives in themselves. So you can see here I've written about one participant in one of my research papers. I'll describe what I'm seeing. I'll describe the particular process that was going on, which was identity construction, and then I'll have a similar length quote that hopefully evidences it, and then another fairly lengthy quote, sometimes longer than the ones I have on the screen, but for the purposes of clarity, I did look for the slightly shorter ones. But it is a very story-like, with examples approach to writing up that results section, rather than what we might find in traditional thematic analysis, where we have, the theme and then some quotes, and then a theme and then some quotes. So, thank you very much for listening. I hope that gave you a little bit of insight into the ways that one researcher does narrative analysis. If it was helpful, then I hope that that my approach works for you, that it will lead you to being able to tackle your own narrative data. If you want to know more about me or find some more of my publications, then my institutional website is shown on the screen. Bye for now.